Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we will look at the effect of weather on your sales. I am Deborah Braquet, Marketing Manager for Solventure LIFe, and with me today is our CEO of Solventure, Professor Dr. Bram Desmet. Okay, let's take a look at the agenda for today. So we'll start with an introduction of Solventure LIFe, and then we'll continue on taking a look at how weather affects your sales. Professor Dr. Bram Desmet will show you two cases of how weather can have an impact on the sales, one case in retail, one case in B2B. In the end, we will also show you how you then typically approach these types of analysis with our leading indicator forecasting methodology. We'll leave 10 minutes in the end for some questions and answers. All right, let's start. So Solventure LIFe. Who are we? So at Solventure LIFe, we are experienced in advanced predictive analytics. So over the past 5 years, we have been conducting a lot of research and building up expertise in how to use external information into the business planning processes. So what we've seen is that by including external factors, we not only improve the forecast accuracy, sales forecast accuracy, business or longer-term strategic forecast accuracy, but we also gain a lot of insights in how our market environment looks like and what are really the demand drivers for our business. So what we've done is we've developed a tool where we gather information from various data providers. Think of the FRED, Federal Reserve of Economic Data. That's more macroeconomic data like Eurostat, OECD, but then also, for example, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which gathers weather information, and then also, of course, weather information from country-based. So we gather a lot of data. We can also tap into private data providers like LMC or ISIS. Any data basically we can use to do our analysis. So up till now we have more than 2 million indicators in our database, and what we've seen then throughout or across different industries, we see that not all industries are affected by the same type of external data. When we look at more B2B types of industries like discrete or chemical, we see that macroeconomic indicators have a really big influence there, and it's significant, let's say. Whether when we look at FMCG and retail, it's also very important to take into account promotions, events, calendar effects, these types of things. But what we've seen is that weather is basically important for all these types of industries, because weather is influence your sales at different stages of the supply chain. All right. This is an overview of some of our customers within those industries. And then I would also like to give a little word on Solventure Group. So Solventure LIFe, as I told you, we're advanced forecasting analytics where we use leading indicators, global data to improve forecast accuracy and long-term business planning. You can find information on our website, leadingindicatorforecasting.com. But within the Solventure Group, there's two other business lines, Solventure S&OP. So that's where we're active in sales, inventory, and operations planning. So we focus on people, process, tools, and analytics, and we basically do software-based consultancy. And then there's also the Solventure Academy. So we've been around in the supply chain environment for a long time, and we've gathered knowledge, both academic and operational knowledge, which we like to share with all of you. So we organize trainings in the form of an accelerator day, which is 1 day on a specific topic like demand planning or inventory. And then we also do boost camps, so that's really tailor-made to your needs. So, all right, so that's the Solventure Group. Now let's get down to how weather affects your sales. Now, let's take a recap. In our previous webinar, we have talked about macroeconomic indicators. So, and that the sales of a lot of companies is impacted by external demand drivers. For example, the oil price, if your business is dependent on the oil price and there's a peak in the oil price, then it will probably generate an effect on your sales. So it's important to find out what macroeconomic indicators are important for your business. Of course, there's not only macroeconomic external indicators which have an impact, there's also internal indicators which are impacting your sales. So to really understand your sales data, it's important to take all of these effects into account. So our price, consumer price index. In another webinar, we have discussed how certain events can impact your sales. So for example, Christmas, Chinese New Year, Easter. If your business is, for example, located in China, before you start looking for macroeconomic indicators, it's important to really understand that sales data and know which kind of effects and events you need to take into account. So if your business is located in China, as I said, and there's Chinese New Year, then you have to make sure that you know if there's an impact of Chinese New Year. Yes, will it initiate a drop or a peak in your sales, and when? So these are also very important things you need to take into account before you start looking for macroeconomic data. Now, of course, events, that's not the only thing. There's also weather. We know, for example, when temperatures is rising and you're selling ice creams, that you'll probably sell more ice creams when the weather is really hot. Rain, for example, when you know it's a wet summer, you expected to sell a lot of ice creams, but due to the weather, you're not selling what you expect. So rain can also have an impact. Hurricanes, if you're selling ice creams and there's a hurricane, people can't go to the shop to buy them because it prevents people from shopping. So that's also something which you need to take into account. And then, for example, winter. Let's think of, for example, if you're driving your car and it starts snowing or winter starts early, then you probably need to change your tires into winter tires. Now, sellers of tires, they have to be ready to have enough inventory of winter tires when there's an early winter. So there's all types of effects you need to take into account when you're analyzing your sales data. Now, apart from the weather events, and macroeconomic factors, there's of course also other things like legal implications which you need to take into account. And this information is very valuable to really understand your data and to really be prepared and know what you're gonna sell. So as I said, we've been around for a long time in the supply chain environment and within a lot of companies, and we've seen that these types of external and internal effects are not always taken into account. And really, when you start thinking about it, you can't imagine what the impact is of taking these effects into account. So let's take a look at two examples. Now I'll invite you to Professor Dr. Bram Desmet, who will show you two cases where weather has an impact.
The goal of this webinar was to say, okay, but how do I include extra effects? For the people who attended the previous webinar, in the previous webinar we talked about promotions. And we have shown how certainly for FMCG companies, promotions have a huge effect on the variability. Actually, the effect can be that strong that companies think that the macroeconomic effects are not important. Well, in the previous webinar, we have shown that's not the case. You really need to account for the different sources of variability to be able to come to a good forecast. And okay, if you're in FMCG, promos will be one of them. That's what we discussed in the previous webinar. In this webinar, we want to discuss weather effects. So what's the impact of weather effects and how do we include them? Well, in general, we see there is a double effect of weather. Assume you are selling swimming pools or you would be selling ice cream. Well, in general, we expect there's two effects of weather. A first important effect is timing. If you have an early summer peak, you will start selling earlier. If you have a late summer peak, talking in European terms, if you would have unexpectedly hot weather in September or early October, that would kind of create a late peak. So the timing of the weather really defines the timing of your sales. So that's certainly a first effect. A second effect is simply the volume. Yeah? If I have a hot summer, I will most probably sell more air conditioning compared to having a very weak, cold and wet summer. Yeah? So we have a timing effect, but we simply also have a volume effect. Yeah? And depending on how important these effects are, well, it may simply be impossible to come to a good forecast, and we will try to give two examples later on. These examples sound very simple. Yeah? Reality is always a bit more complex than it seems. Just to give you an example, well, let's recap our air conditioning example. Well, most probably there will be a different behavior if I look at consumer products. Yeah? So many of us might have this type of things in-house. Yeah? Professional products, yeah, which you might recognize from hotels or shopping malls, or industrial products. Yeah? So if I make air conditioning, I might also make, I don't know, coolers for plastics or coolers for wine or whatever. Consumer products may also depend on the region. Yeah? If you are in Phoenix, Arizona, well, you will not build a house without air conditioning. Yeah? If you are somewhere in a central location like Belgium or the Netherlands, Germany, if you're somewhere in those countries of Europe, yeah, you will see that not everybody who builds a new house necessarily installs air conditioning. Why? Because summers are not always extremely hot. So you will see that the biggest weather impact will certainly come here from the consumer products in those countries which have, on average, let us say, summers where you can survive without air conditioning. So the weather dependency will certainly be less if you look at professional products. Well, if you build a hotel, you will include air conditioning, right? And whether you buy yes or no will not depend on the weather. The same for industrial cooling. You basically need it. Yeah? And this might more be macroeconomic in the sense that if economy is weak, there will be less investment, so I will sell less industrial products, but it will be less weather driven. Yeah? Consumers in general only buy when it's hot. So if it's hot, I buy ice cream. If it's hot, I buy air conditioning. So the dependency here is expected to be the highest.
Is it worth the effort? Should we really care? Because I think we've also seen in a poll that a lot of companies do have the weather effect, but at the same time we see that only a little amount of companies are actively modeling weather in their forecast model. So is it important? Should we care? Well, we will show two examples. One of a retail example. It's about swimming pools which are obviously weather related. And we will give a B2B example, which is in the aftermarket of automotive. So for instance, if you have spark plugs, they can easily break down in winter. So that's a second example which we will look at. Let's start with the retail example, the swimming pools. What's the data we collected here? Swimming pool sales. We look at the months of June to August, so we look at 3 months of data, and we looked at that for the period 2012 till 2016. And this is an example of the sales, so it's 3 months, June, July, August for 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. So what do you notice? Yeah, you can notice that the average sales is probably quite low. It's not that high, but you see important peaks. You see important peaks here in 2012. You see even higher peaks in 2013. You see a dramatic peak here in 2015. And that peak over here is really, it's more than a factor 10. You can easily see that or observe that. It can even be a factor 100 if you would compare it to the baseline sales outside of that season. And the question we have asked ourselves is, how do we how do we correctly model this weather information, because if you want to make a forecast and you don't control for the weather influence, you will certainly end up with a bad forecast. Also notice the two aspects we started with. There is an impact on the timing. Well, you can clearly see here that in 2012 the summer started quite slow and there was a relatively late summer peak here in 2012. If we look at 2014, it's different. We see that there was already a high sales in June, so that was an early winter peak. In 2015, you see here an enormous peak. We will come back to that peak because that's certainly one of the most difficult to model. And for the people living in Belgium or the neighborhood of Belgium, we know that in Western Europe, again, June has been a very good month, so there has been a huge surge in sales of swimming pools. So controlling the timing, but also sheerly controlling the volume, because you will have sold less in 2012 compared to 2015. It's quite obvious to see. So it's about timing and it's about the total volume that is being sold. What if we don't use the weather information? And what would we then use? It's daily data. So what we could typically use, certainly in a retail environment, is the day of the week. People go for work on Monday and Tuesday, so then you sell less. You typically sell less, sell more on a Friday or on a Saturday, if you would be open, you would sell more on a Sunday. You sell more in the weekends. You sell less in the working days. The month can have an impact. So in general, July and August are holiday periods, so you may typically sell more in those months compared to June, where people with children have the children still in school, so they're not yet on holiday. So we can start with just taking a look at calendar effects. And so this is really a first simple attempt where we say, I take a look at the month in the year. So we have June, July and August. You see the three different levels for the three different months. And then we can model the day of the week. And you see that the day in the week already has a small effect. You see small peaks here. So typically you sell more in the weekends, you sell less on working days. So that's variability which can be explained by calendar effects. That's not enough. So we kind of sense that the peaks here must be explained with the weather. So what if we include a simple weather variable in the model? Let's say that we include the average daily temperature. So if I took the 20th of June, what was the average temperature on the 20th of June? What was the average temperature on the 21st of June? And we take that as a continuous variable into our forecasting model. Let's see what that gives. Well, we see that we explain more variance, and some of the peaks are already modeled quite well. So if I look here at the end of 2012, I see this peak is better modeled. If I look at 2013, I see that some of the upward peaks, we at least have part of the explanation. We don't explain the peak to the full extent. Same over here, 2014, we see sales increases when temperature is higher. So that peak over here is certainly has to do something with weather. But we don't explain all of the peaks to the full extent. So we still miss an important part of the peak here in 2014, certainly the beginning of June 2014. Also, if I look here at 2015, this enormous peak, well, by just taking the weather, the average temperature into account, we explain part of the peak, but we miss a significant part of the peak. And at the same time, you can also see that we predict peaks where there were not really peaks. So if you look here at the beginning of 2012, based on the average temperature, I would have expected peaks, but the actual sales was much lower. The same here if you look at the beginning of 2016, you see that we expect some peaks. Actually, one peak has realized, but for the rest, the sales was relatively flat. So this is just taking into account weather as a single variable. So how can we further improve the modeling? Because we're clearly not yet there. Well, we can certainly add extra weather variables, like if you go to the NOAA, or if you would go to regional bureaus in Europe, you can easily get data on the minimum and maximum daily temperature. You can say, well, maybe my sales of today also depends on the temperature of yesterday or on the temperature of 2 days ago. Yeah? And maybe the sales of today also depends on the weather forecast for tomorrow or within 2 days. If we predict good weather, maybe we will sell more, or maybe if we had 2 or 3 days of good weather, that kind of supports the sales also into the future, or it carries the sales a little bit into the future. So we can take lags and leads of that average temperature. We can also say that, okay, what if you would classify a summer day as we reach a temperature of more than 25 degrees Celsius, and even a hot day, which is more than 30 degrees Celsius. We could also look at precipitation. So we can add extra weather variables trying to improve the model. This shows what that does. Well, if we look at some of the peaks, the peak over here is not now much better explained. If we look at the peaks over here, middle of 2013, it's better explained. Also that peak here in 2016, this peak is better explained. But at the same time, you see that we are still over forecasting part. So the beginning of 2012, really the beginning of June has lowered, but here, let us say, second half of June, we predict the peak, which was not really there. So adding extra temperature variables does improve the model, but it's not fully complete. Certainly, if we look here at the big peak in 2015, we see that we still got that one relatively wrong. What else can we do? Well, instead of using an additive model, which we've done so far, we can use a multiplicative model. And what does that mean? It means that, well, instead of saying if I go from 19 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, which is plus 1 degree Celsius, instead of saying plus 1 degree Celsius gives, I don't know, 100 extra sales of swimming pools, we use a multiplication, meaning that instead of saying it's plus 100, we say, for instance, it's plus 10%. How does that help? Well, it means that plus 1 degree Celsius will have a different effect in June compared to July, because your baseline sales in July will be higher. And so we might try a multiplicative model and see whether that helps. If we do that, it helps a little bit, especially if I look over here in 2015, that bigger peak, it's a little bit better explained, but again, we're still not satisfied, we're still not there. Yeah? And yeah, what we believe from the projects we have run and from the research that we have done is that you really need to transform the sales variable. Why? Because the effect is not linear, and I will come back to that. So what we have done is make transformations of the sales variable to take into account a nonlinear behavior. And what is the nonlinear behavior? It means, well, if you go from 18 degrees Celsius to 19 degrees Celsius, that's plus 1 degree. Well, that plus 1 degree will have a different effect compared to going from 24 to 25 degrees Celsius. Yeah? So the impact on the sales really depends on where you are, let us say, in the temperature buildup, in the temperature curve. That behavior is nonlinear, and you will need to transform your sales variables to be able to take that nonlinearity into account. If you do that for the first time, we really see that we start to better match this summer peak here in 2015, that more extreme effect. And is that important that you match that extreme peak here? Because you could say, yeah, well, as long as I can correctly predict the other years, well, maybe 2015 was that extreme that it's not a big issue if I can't model exactly 2015. Well, it is important. Why? Because if you make an error here, that error basically influences the forecasting model, right? You always try to match that 2015 peak. So if you don't add the right type of variable so that you can really explain this extreme type of behavior, it will always cause an error in other parts of the forecast modeling. So it is important that you get that fully correct. So what else can we do? Because we see that the nonlinear behavior, if we take that into account, provides for a better fit. But okay, it's better, but it's still not, let's say, comparable to what we see here in 2014. Well, something else which we did, and okay, this is really part of the expertise we have built. It's different types of sales have a different type of complexity, and modeling that is really a skill that you need to build up. And herefore, because it's a retail example, we know that festivities and official holidays have an important influence. So what we saw here is that in that around that big peak we have a festivity which is called Pentecost. It's Pinksteren, as we would say in Dutch, and that first, let us say, weather peak also coincides with the first weeks of the summer holidays. So beginning of July, holidays really starts because schools have closed. So when you have hot weather really in the beginning of the summer holiday, you can also expect that has an extra effect. So let's see if that really holds true. And so we adapted the model. So we add Pentecost, and we add an interaction between the temperature and the fact that it's the first week of the summer holidays. And if we do that, then we finally see that this extreme peak here, we get a really good explanation of this peak. And in general, if you can better match that extreme peak, you will also see that other peaks are better managed, right? Because if you can't, let's say, predict that extreme peak quite well, it will introduce errors into the forecast model. So this is one example. We deliberately took a retail example. Why? Because if you want to know how to control weather influences in your sales, I think retail is the best example to look for, and certainly an example like swimming pools is an ideal example to start working on. So this is how we build our knowledge, but we certainly port that knowledge to different situations, like the business-to-business example I will give in a second step. And so if we would summarize here, what are some of the key challenges to include weather effects in the forecasting model? Well, the first question you will face is like, how do you define weather? That's where we really started. Do I look at the temperature? And if I say temperature, do you say average temperature, or do you say maximum temperature or minimum temperature? Or is it not only temperature, but is it more the hours of sunshine? Or is it the precipitation? Or is it a combination of the different variables? So how to define weather, that's already a difficult question in itself. So be aware that you will face that question. A second important challenge is, how do you deal with the nonlinear behavior of the weather? So in the example, we have shown that if you would use a linear model, it's impossible to get a good model and to make a good forecast. You really need to model the fact that the weather influence is non-linear. So if you go from 24 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees Celsius, that's a 2 degrees Celsius increase. Suppose you would be selling ice cream. Your increase in ice cream sales will be much bigger if you go from 24 to 26 compared to 16 degrees going to 18 degrees. So you know that, you'll need to model that. And a third challenge we really had to solve in this example we've just shown is the interaction effects, because we've also seen the fact that you have hot weather really in the beginning of July, which is the beginning of a holiday period, and it also coincided with something like Pentecost. All of that leads to a much more dramatic increase in sales compared to having 26 degrees outside the holiday period. So there is an interaction. Weather is not standing on itself, it interacts with the other effects influencing your sales. And these are really three things which make weather quite complex to model. It's not easy. Also, if you would dig into the literature, you will see that there is some research, but most of that seems to be proprietary, done by retailers. There's not a lot out there in the open space, and you really need to tackle at least these three complexities if you want to model weather effects in a good way. Yeah, you might be thinking now, yeah, but how does that help? Because I will never have a reliable weather forecast 3 to 18 months out. So maybe I understand the historical influence of the weather, but I can't predict what the weather is going to do. Well, I agree. You can't predict the weather 3 to 18 months out, but what we can do is the following. We do have a lot of history. Yeah, we measure weather, temperature, rainfall, and so on for 100 years in many countries. So there is a lot of history available, and that easily helps us to define, like, okay, what's the 5th percentile, meaning that what's the level of temperature, just to give an example, where we have only 5% chance of doing worse. What's the median, meaning what's the temperature level where we have a 50% chance to do worse or to do better. And what's the 95th percentile? What's the level of temperature where we say there's only a 5% chance the temperature will be higher than this, so what's really kind of the limit for hot weather. So there is a lot of history which allows you to compile this type of scenarios. So what's a bad summer, what's a median summer, and what's a very good summer, what's a hot summer. And you can apply this type of scenarios also to look into the future and say, what will my sales be like if it's an average summer? What will my sales be like if it's a very hot summer, or if it's a very bad summer? And that holds for temperature in the summer. It also holds for temperature in the winter. Yeah? So I can have a very strong winter. I can have a very mild winter. I can have a lot of snow. I can have little to no snow. We can distill scenarios from the weather history we have, and then use that to run scenarios for your sales into the future. So that's really what we want to do with weather information. And a second example from a different domain, business to business again. If you want to learn how to forecast, or let's say account for weather influences in your sales, it's better to look for a retail example, because there the effects are typically more obvious. But of course, and many of the participants today are more in the business-to-business space. We will also give one example we've studied there. So this is from an aftermarket automotive supplier, and we're looking at a product range which is quite, let us say, winter dependent. So yeah, you can think of something like spark plugs. If it starts freezing, the spark plugs break and they need to be replaced. And yeah, again, it's like air conditioning. Yeah? As a consumer, you don't replace your spark plugs upfront. You just wait until they break down because of the weather. And also the distributors, they will not order spark plugs upfront. So they will only order new spark plugs when they have sold the ones they had already on stock or the ones they had available. So for you as a B2B supplier, you really have to sit and wait probably for the first freezing to kick in. And we are looking here at data for Switzerland and Austria. We have 3 years of history, so yeah, what strikes us is that we see 3 peaks, which are winter peaks. These 2 peaks here are in October, so these are October peaks, and in 2016 there is a peak in September, and it's already obvious that these peaks are really, let's say, the first winter peaks. So when it starts freezing, you know that a lot of the cars, certainly older cars out there, will have problems with this, for instance, the spark plugs, which needs to be replaced. So it's an early winter peak. And once they have been replaced, probably your sales will drop to a kind of a normal level. And this is influenced by the weather. So again, let's look at what happens if we run this type of pattern through traditional forecasting techniques. And if you are not accounting for weather, you might be running a statistical forecasting in your current forecasting software, and that might apply a normal seasonal technique like a Winters method. So how would a Winters method deal with that? Let's first say, like, okay, what if we would take into account the history up till October 2015. So we take the history up till October 2015, where we have the black line here, and we make a forecast for the next year. So we make a forecast for November 2015 up till October 2016. Well, what you can expect is that because you had a peak here in October 2014, you had a peak in October 2015, well, the forecasting model will just predict a peak in October 2016. That's what the forecast model will do. That creates a big issue. Why? Because we already know that the actual peak happened in September instead of October. So if you run a weather-dependent pattern through a traditional statistical forecasting model, you can end up in serious troubles, right? If you have the goods available here in October, but you actually needed them in September, you can miss a lot of sales, and you will create a lot of operational firefighting costs trying to close the gap. It will also negatively impact your on-time and full service level, so you want to stay out of that. And then you could say, yeah, but maybe you've chosen a very specific example here, because it will not be the case that it's always exactly October. Well, that's true. So let's do it differently. Let's see what happens if we take the data up till October 2016. So we now take into account the 2016 actuals, and we make a forecast for 2017. So we make a forecast up till October 2017. Well, now I have 3 years of history in the forecasting model, and remember that the first 2 peaks, they were in October, and that the 3rd peak here was in September. Well, if you run this through a traditional forecasting model, what you will get is a kind of a blurred peak. You will see that you get a blurred peak which has a kind of a first peak in October and then a second peak in September. And the volume, the total volume here in this 2 months will be comparable to the volume here in a September peak or in an October peak. So even if you would say, well, sometimes it's October, sometimes it's September, it doesn't help to run that through a traditional forecasting model. You will simply have blurred peaks, like you would have comparable issues if you have shifting seasonal effects, like if you have Easter or the Ramadan or Chinese New Year, which is shifting around, that typically creates blurred peaks if you run that through a traditional forecasting model. So what can we do? Well, we can model the temperature and say, okay, well, we know that in this case the first freezing is really causing that first peak. So we can introduce either the temperature, or we can say we introduce a variable which tells us when it starts freezing or when was the first, let us say, winter peak. And we see two things here. Well, first of all, we can really explain the peaks at the right time. Right? So here we explain the peaks in October, and here we explain it in September. But again, there is the bonus. There is also the interaction effect, because this one also shows that typically September is already a better month. So when you get that early winter peak in September, the peak will also be higher. So it's again an interaction effect, because it's September and you have the first winter peak. That combined effect leads to a higher peak compared to having, let's say, the first winter peak in October. So that's another example of those interaction effects, which we also discussed in more detail when looking at a retail example. And these were two examples, one from the retail, then more translating results of the retail to a business-to-business type of environment. So again, as a kind of summary here, various external effects influencing your sales. And why should you be taking these into account? Well, first of all, to get a better sense of your sales data. If you don't know how big is the influence of weather on the historical sales, then tell me how you will ever make a good forecast for next year. If you don't know the historical influence of sales, it's impossible to know what is really due to your sales efforts, the fact that you have new products launched, the fact that you have invested in opening new sales offices and so on. All of your sales growth over the last 2 to 3 years may simply be due to weather effects, which are completely outside of your control. So you need to do it to get a better sense of your sales data. Making better decisions by including the impact of the weather. When we look forward, be able to run scenarios like, what will the sales be like if we have an average summer, if we have a good summer? What will it be like if we have a strong winter, if we have a mild winter? And if I would have a strong winter, do I want to put inventory for all of my SKUs for that strong winter scenario? Or do I say, if it's a really strong winter, I don't need stock for all of my products, but maybe I want to have, I don't know, like 20% of my SKUs where I really put that winter stock so that I make sure that I never sell out even in extreme winter conditions. And what is certainly more difficult is understanding those combined influences. So we've seen that if that first winter peak comes in September, the peak will be higher compared to when it comes in October, or when that first summer or that first summer temperature comes in the first week of July. Because it's a holiday period, the effect will be much higher compared to having the first summer peak somewhere in June. So understanding the interaction effects, again, not easy, but it's crucial to understand what is driving your sales. And all of this should certainly help to improve your inventory management, which is difficult for weather-dependent products. And improving your inventory management needs to help you to the right service levels, prevent customers from going to the competition, and at the same time prevent you to get stuck with obsolete inventory, because if you always stock for the maximum, you will be carrying a lot of slow-moving inventory in slower selling periods of the year. So all of this, I hope, has given you a better idea of what are the specifics you need to take a look at when you want to model weather information, or when to model weather effects in your forecast. And I will now hand back over to Deborah.
All right, so thank you all for joining the webinar. Thank you all for listening. So look forward to see you again. So thank you Bram as well for joining, and see you next time. Bye.